Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Lee Walton. I am the Dean of the School of Divinity here at Wake Forest University. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, students, and larger university, I would like to welcome all of you to the Margaret A. Steelman Lecture Series. The Steelman family, originally from Hickory, North Carolina, endowed this lecture series with the launch of the Divinity School. They endowed it in 1998. Dr. Sanford and Mrs. Margaret Steelman wanted to ensure that a steady stream of prominent scholars of religion, theology, and culture would come through the halls of Wake Forest University School of Divinity. And with this gift, Wake Divinity has welcomed such towering intellectuals as William Schweiker, Diana Butler Bass, and Elizabeth Johnson. And the tradition continues this year with this evening's keynote speaker. To introduce our lecturer, I would like to welcome to the podium Dr. Derek S. Hicks. Dr. Hicks is an associate professor of religion and culture here at the School of Divinity, as well as the director of the Center for Research, Engagement, and Collaboration in African American Life at Wake Forest University. Please receive Dr. Hicks.
Well, let me extend a good afternoon to you as well. How's everybody doing this evening, or afternoon? Good. I have been tasked with the introduction of our speaker, and I was thinking, I cannot remember the exact day, year, or time that we met, which is rare for me. But I also cannot remember any time in the last, say, 8 years that I have not been fed by her towering knowledge, her, as those who were here earlier, her sharp and wondrous intellectual critique, her ability to make things plain that are exceedingly complex. She is, as I've stated before, a tour de force. And we are all lucky and blessed this evening, this afternoon, to have her among us. Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson is professor and chair of the Department of American Studies at the University of Maryland in College Park. She is an affiliate faculty member of the Theater, Dance, and Performing Studies, the Departments of African American Studies, Anthropology, the Harriet Tubman Department of Women and Gender and Sexuality Studies, and the Consortium on Race, Gender, and Ethnicity. Dr. Williams-Forson is the author of Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America, which was just published by UNC Press. And I will say that I've been lucky to have had conversations over the years with her, so much so that the book used to be entitled Don't Yuck My Yum. And I just could not wait until the book came out, so we are really, really fortunate this evening. She is also the co-editor of Taking Food Public, Redefining Food in a Changing World, and the author of the award-winning Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, Black Women, Food, and Power, also with UNC Press 2006, a book, I might add, that bridges so many gaps in terms of its interdisciplinary focus, that folks from American studies to history to gender studies to religion all call that particular book one that they make reference to and utilize often. She is known nationally and internationally for her pioneering work in building the scholarly subfield of Black food studies, and has published numerous articles, on the aspect of material lives of African Americans in the United States from the late 19th century to the present. This includes topics like Black women, food and power, food and literature, food and sustainability, race, food and design thinking, eating and workplace cultures, as well as the historical legacies of race and gender misrepresentation, with and without food, and more. She has also been interviewed on several podcasts on NPR, Radio New Zealand, the Associated Press, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, MSNBC, and the New York Times, among others. She has also been featured in documentaries such as Netflix's Ugly Delicious and The Invisible Vegan. Dr. Williams-Forson holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park, certificate in Women's Studies, also at University of Maryland, an MA in American Studies from University of Maryland, and a BA in English and African American Studies and Women's Studies from the University of Virginia. Without a doubt, we are in for a wonderful time this evening, and so I bring to you the blessing that is Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson.
Good afternoon, and thank you so very much for that very warm welcome. First, I want to extend thanks to Dean Walton for this invitation, certainly to my friend and colleague, the good Dr. Derek Hicks, and anyone else who had their hand in this gathering, my agent, Rolisa Tutwiler, who was the best, and last but never least, the distinguished guests who are here, as I understand, visiting today. And then last but not least, Sue Robinson, who accommodated me so graciously. Thanks to all of you. So the last time I visited Wake Forest was in 2014 for the Half the Sky, Half the Earth conference on women, food, and faith. And at that time, I presented a lecture entitled, or a paper titled, "I Heard You in the Garden, and I Was Afraid Because I Was Naked. Race, Food Shaming, and the Politics of Eating Right." Many of those thoughts have come together in my recently published Eating While Black, Food Shaming and Race in America. Of course, some of those ideas, most of those ideas have evolved. But my remarks today are designed to encourage you to consider African American foodways in its many complexities, and to consider grace. We need a lot of grace right now. Our nation is torn asunder by age-old and worn-out narratives of racism, sexism, misogyny, war, strife. Seemingly, we are all living in the fall, and yet there's too little compassion. Let me share with you what I mean by this. In the opening of Eating While Black, or let me give you one example. In the opening of Eating While Black, something happened in Washington, D.C. in 2019. An African American Metropolitan Area Transit Authority employee was photographed while in uniform eating on the Metro train. Natasha Tynes, who was a passenger on the train, took a photo of the employee and then tweeted it with the comment, and here's the comment: "When you're on your morning commute and you see a WMATA employee in uniform eating on the train, I thought we were not allowed to eat on the train. This is unacceptable. Hope at WMATA responds." Tynes goes on to say, she asked the employee about this, the employee said, "Worry about yourself." So one of the things I question is, what in the world would possess a person, an author, a World Bank employee, to take a picture and then post it as a tweet? Why would anyone other than those on the train need to know what this employee was doing? Why also did Tynes feel as if it was her duty to inform the world via social media? And what was the actual point of the communication? right? Most of us who use the DC, Maryland, Virginia Metro are familiar with the policy that you can't eat on the train, and most of us also applaud when other people subvert this. But challenging the policy was not, in fact, necessarily what was going on here, right? Because while the Metro forbids eating or drinking, apparently an email had gone out earlier in the month advising Metro workers to stop ticketing, or Metro Transit Police to stop ticketing people for these kinds of subversions. So the transit worker was very much aware of what was going on. Tynes, however, was not. So what was Tynes' purpose? Well, in the book, what I look at is Black people's food cultures and the ways that they are shamed and the ways that Black people are surveilled, even in the most innocuous situations. So I put this conversation in a broader context of structural and systemic racism, violence and degradation, socioeconomics and exploitation. Now, let me just say really quickly, I'm very clear that I'm in North Carolina. I'm also very clear that some of you are not gonna like this talk, and that's fine for me. I'm used to that, right? I grew up in Virginia, in rural Virginia, in Farmville, Virginia, okay, in the seat of Brown v. Board of Topeka, Kansas. So I'm okay if you don't like it, but it's the truth that I'm bringing, and I'm hoping that you will embrace it with your wit and your wisdom, and hopefully you will take it and use it to open up conversations about people and identities and cultures and heritages and traumas, or not. But I'm gonna tell this truth today. So when I wrote this book, I'm using food shaming and controlling as a central theme. I look at Black people's experiences because our relationships to food are and historically always have been very intricate, right? Our criticism, from criticism of our food waste to scarcity, to creativity, to ingenuity. And yet, despite all of the scholarship on African Americans in food, Black chefs, Black-owned eateries and restaurants, most people still believe, and this is across the board, all races, including Black folks, that African American food cultures derived almost solely from scraps, or only the worst pieces of meat and offal, which is animal entrails. There's also an inaccurate impression that all Black people primarily eat what is commonly known as soul food: fried chicken, fried fish, cornbread, collard greens, mac and cheese, which are really also Southern foods, right? These are foods that are eaten and cooked in the South. However, we know this is not the case. No matter where you come from, Black people are not all the same. In fact, the term Black is all-encompassing to include folks from the Caribbean and throughout the African diaspora. And so when you look below the surface of any food conversation and you dig deeper, you usually find very dense, multi-layered, complex conversations that are always informed by who we are. And we all have a gender, we all have a class, we all have a region, we all have levels of exposure and family dynamics, and we all come from cultural groups. So while food conversations seem simple, it is, and because we all eat, really, these conversations should leave many of us thinking a lot more deeply about the subject. In fact, the subject is very taken for granted. So let me just say a word here about how I'm framing this discussion. Omi and Winant, who are, Michael Omi, Howard Winant, are sociologists who argue that racial projects generally frame how we operate with race throughout the world. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because when Black folks talk about race, people want to say that we are playing the victim or we're playing the race card. Well, actually, that's not true. Because racial projects are so normalized that they move throughout every part of our society. It's a racial project that makes a barista in Starbucks or any other coffee shop believe that they need to call the police because a lone Black man is sitting in a coffee shop without having ordered, even though he's just simply there waiting for the rest of his party. It's also a racial project that empowers a woman to call the police because Black people are cooking out while at the beach. And it's absolutely a racial project that would embolden a stranger to take a picture of a Black woman eating while at her place of work and post it on social media. So again, when African American people point out these racial aggressions, whether large or small, we are accused of playing the race card or the victim because, after all, what's the big deal? I'm encouraged by what scholar activist Kianga Yamada Taylor said on Twitter in response to folks saying, well, we hold workshops on racism. And she says, the notion that we will end racism one workshop at a time, one white person at a time, really undermines what structural racism really is. Because racism can be found in real estate, housing, employment, and beyond isn't because there are not enough nice white people in the world. The entire point is that it doesn't matter if you're nice or not nice. Capital relies on racism. That's just a fact. Capital relies on racism. Capital built this country. Black people built this country through the process of enslavement. That's just a fact. We need to just live with it and get through it. So she says the entire point is it doesn't matter if you're nice. It relies on racism to extract, exploit, accumulate, and profit. She also says that by creating systems of lack and inequality and perpetuating narratives of inferiority, society cements structural differences that seem normal because they're widespread throughout society, throughout every facet of our lives, and it's not between individuals, it's about systems. Okay. Taylor goes on to point out to only focus on interpersonal relationships means you're ignoring the social and material world in which these relationships exist. This is just high liberal folly dancing around the idea that we can educate ourselves out of structures, and that ignorance is at the root of inequality. So there is structural racism in food, from lack of restaurant franchise ownership to the erasure of any acknowledgement that historically and today many Black women and chefs have been, who have been culinary masters, have been repeatedly shut out of opportunities. So all of these are part of the racial projects that are often rendered invisible in their execution because they appear as commonplace single-story narratives, and they are reinforced because they are played and replayed throughout popular culture, in magazines, in the daily news, throughout social history, and through daily implicit actions. Though often visibly displayed, these projects of racially discriminatory thinking are entrenched and lodged deeply in food policies, leading to practices where this work can be carried out. Now, here's where I unravel the narrative. And I hope you all engage me with different looks, because right now I'm getting like blank stares, and that's okay. Even though you're blinded a little bit by the lights, I can see it. But here's where I'm gonna unravel this a little bit. The ways of thinking form the bedrock of discourses. These ways of thinking form the bedrock of discourses on food desert. I have an image here of Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Adichie, who calls out this concern in her narrative, or in her TED Talk, actually. It's a 10-15-minute TED Talk called The Danger of the Single Story. And she says, when you show people as one thing over and over again, that's what they become and that's what they believe. So let's look at what she's talking about. Images such as this at the Coon Chicken Inn, which was a real-life restaurant out in the Midwest. Or perhaps this image here, this stereo view of a man with 2 watermelon and a chicken in front. And he has to decide, does he want the chicken or does he want the watermelon? Or Mammy's Cupboard, which is right down the road in Natchez, Mississippi, right? These are all real life places and issues that exist. So when folks say that you're making this up and you're playing the race card, if you're driving through Natchez, Mississippi, you might see Mammy's Cupboard. Or you might even see this particular advertisement for Obama Chicken after he won the presidency the first time. Okay. So when society repeatedly tells you through popular culture, social media, and other technology that all Black people are criminals in need of being policed and incarcerated, or that we have no bodily control over our appetites, culinary or sexual, so we're like children and thus in need of regulating, or that we are perceived to be cheap and uncouth because we do not tip in restaurants in ways that society deems acceptable, then we are bound to see and have gross distortions about African American people's culinary patterns. These missing representations inform ideologies, which inform how we approach social issues and how we write policies about food. From this vantage point, those images I just showed you, of course soul food is bad and unhealthy because it's primarily associated with Black people. Focusing on this point of view and not on the fact that Southerners more generally tend to eat heavily seasoned foods with sugar, pork products, cream, and other fatty ingredients because they form a template for the tastiness of their foods. Instead of focusing on that, we place the emphasis on Black negativity and not on cultural diversity of the region. So people, we need grace. We need grace. Growing up as the daughter of a Baptist preacher and a social action teacher, we were exposed to many religions. We traveled a lot with my dad's job during the summers, while he marched with Cesar Chavez, Angela Davis, and my mom watched Barbara Jordan on Watergate. We attended the World Council of Churches summer camp and learned a lot about saying grace and how to give grace. For example, the Johnny Appleseed grace. Do people know Johnny Appleseed? I'm not going to sing it because I can't sing, but oh, the Lord is good to me, and so I thank the Lord for giving me the things I need, the sun, the rain, the appleseed. Oh, the Lord has been good to me, right? As I said, I'm also a daughter of South Central rural Virginia, and grace was an inherited legacy. And so we learned to say, Lord God, we thank you for this bounty. We also learn God is great, God is good. Let us thank you for our food. Bow our heads, we all are fed. Thank you, Lord, for our daily bread. Amen. This was our quick fast in a hurry prayer when we felt like we were starving. So saying grace and giving saying grace is a given in my life, and grace tells stories. Whether you say it or not, it tells a story. How you say it tells a story. When you say it, at home or at school, at work, in your car, on vacation, all of that tells stories. And we like good stories. If my dad is saying grace, my minister dad, oh my God, we brace ourselves, right? Because we know we are going to be in for the longest of prayers that will always end in the Lord's Prayer. So sometimes we turn to my 18-year-old daughter who's spry and quick and is most likely going to say some combination of God is good and Johnny Appleseed. But also a lot like her mama, her grandma, her granddaddy, and her family, her prayer is definitely going to be shorter. So I'm going to take a few minutes and tell you another story about Black folks and grace. And it goes like this. So we come to you today, O Lord, to thank you for this bounty. We thank you, O Lord, for our life, our health, and our strength. That strength is exhibited through the hard work of the enslaved. As more and more scholarship on Black food culture, social media, and so forth has taught us that these early arrivals here on this, what was known then as the colonies, were planters, they were agriculturalists, they were gardeners, cooks, and they demonstrated, some of them, mastery in the kitchen. Now let me stop and say, Black women and men didn't come to this country just knowing how to cook, because as Jessica Harris says, historian Jessica Harris says, the God of bread and saucepan just breathed life onto them. They learned it through being burned at the hearth and so forth and so on. The culinary histories, anthropologists, geographers, and scholars of culture have told us that they've told us all this even when we didn't listen. They did not just garden, these Africans, or garden for others, they gardened for themselves at Monticello, at Thomas Jefferson's home, at Montpelier, and other plantations. Food has always been tied to Black liberation and freedom, and Black women use food to divert attention away, for example, from the sailors during insurrections, and they helped those insurrections to occur by using food to divert one's attention. We have to remember that slavery lasted over 2 centuries, and that in that time, our engagement with religion and spirituality changed, as well as our food. Khalid Beydoun observes that 46% of the slaves in the antebellum South were kidnapped from Africa's western regions, which boasted a significant number of Muslims from Senegambia, which is, Senegal, Gambia, Mali, Guinea. And most of them strived to maintain their religion. They practiced Ramadan, they fasted, they had community meals. Now, why am I bringing this up? Partly because this is one of the reasons why I'm saying we didn't all eat scraps, because if you're Muslim, you weren't going to eat offal and most likely any kind of meat unless it was slaughtered by a Muslim. Then you think about the fact that Africans were surrounded by forests and lakes and rivers and seas. We were, along with indigenous people, among the original foragers and landers and gardeners and survivors. So yes, while we ate differently depending upon where we were enslaved, more than likely, it was more than scraps of pork and a peck of meal. Because think about it, you're hungry, but you know how to identify herbs and berries and nuts, and you see frogs and you see squirrels and you see, turtles, or you see fish in the lake or in the pond or in the river, and you're not going to try and get them? Of course you are. So we have these stories of life despite all of the problems and despite all of the traumas that Black folks were experiencing. We hear a lot, for example, about Hercules Posey, who was enslaved by George Washington and came to be the chef at Washington's Mount Vernon. Posey had what some would call a good life. He was esteemed as an enslaved person. But as one reenactor says, the work for all who were enslaved was grueling in its own way. However, the work of the cook was extremely taxing, mentally and emotionally, because you worked in extreme conditions under the scrutinizing eye of the master and mistress. So the enslaved cook had to perform at a high level at all times, and there was no room for mistakes. Enslaved cooks had to hold it together and manage a staff while meeting the high standards of the family who owned them, and they worked even during those few times the other enslaved laborers didn't. It was a 24/7 job. Indeed, it was sun up to sundown. So along these lines of religion and food and Muslims and Islam, you also had a number of African religions that came together and were practiced under the guise of sometimes saying that they were Christian. There were women who were sorcerers and conjurers and herbalists, and there were women who knew music and dance shouts and ring shouts and how about smoking and burning incense and herbs and healing and using anointing oil and holy water and conjuring. Christianity was not the only religion, and it still is not the only religion. By the antebellum period, communities of the enslaved prayed, sang, shouted, and preached to one another in a manner and in styles that were reminiscent of their African heritage. Healing, faith healing, was a central part of this. But another aspect of religion seeped into our psyches. It's a part that has eclipsed the contributions of Black folks to American history and culture, and it has contributed to the ways some of us have embraced these racial projects that I started out talking about. And here I'm referring to the concept of sacralization. In Eating While Black, I addressed this issue of sacralization as it relates to Hurricane Katrina and it's devastating on the lives of the people in the Gulf, in New Orleans, New Mississippi, and so forth. During the time of Katrina, I noticed that there was very little conversation around food and how people who had been forcibly moved were going to sustain themselves, right? Where is the cultural sustainability? How do people sustain themselves amidst traumas? Collective and cultural traumas can be defined for African Americans through the horrific expanse of enslavement. Repeated traumas for African Americans occur daily. However, stemming from these horrors and the ways they're perpetuated through popular culture, in the news media, through individual beliefs, ideologies, and behaviors, means that many of us are constantly re-traumatized. These traumas are even perpetuated through interpretations of the Bible. So, in chapter 2 in my book, I begin with the biblical interpretation of Noah, the ark, and the great flood. All of this is found in Genesis 8. The primary emphasis in that chapter is on food choices. This is chapter 2 of my book, is on food choices in the midst of movement and travel. So just to remind you about the story of Noah, as you know, the flood happens, then Noah sends out a raven in search of dry land. Comes back, then he sends it out again, it comes back. Then he sends out a dove that never returns. By the time we get to Genesis 9, we learn that Noah is a lover of wine, and he has planted several vineyards. On one occasion, he gets excessively drunk and lays uncovered in his tent. When his son Ham happens upon his father and sees his nakedness, he tells his brothers Shem and Japheth. They, in turn, walk backward with a covering to lay across their father's body. So when Noah wakes up and he finds out what has happened, he's furious and condemns the behavior of his youngest son, ultimately saying, his youngest son being Ham, ultimately saying, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers." Now, there's a lot we can do with this story, and I don't have time to do that. I encourage you to buy the book. But one of the major issues is on dislocation, trauma, shame, and race. And you say, well, what about the food? Well, for the moment, the food is in the background. But the thing we should know about that story is that God is actually silent in the text. God doesn't speak in Genesis 9. He doesn't actually curse Canaan, Ham's son. It's Noah who places the curse. And one scholar, Eliza Thomas, explains the use of Genesis 9 to justify slavery and racial hierarchy grew from a particular strain of European anthropology, not from sound exegesis of the biblical text. Those who wanted to establish a biblical basis for racial superiority suggested that God had sanctioned the curse of Ham, and by extension, all those descended from him, relegating them to be slaves. And a lot of folks to this day believe that they are part of a cursed generation. While it's not clear that the curse of Ham was part of God's design, it's obvious that all three sons came from the same father. They were not different races. Rather than act as a foundation for racial superiority, this story, according to Eliza Thomas, serves to foreshadow the conflict that would later develop between Israel and Canaan. Now, Thomas's explanation is insightful, but so is Pastor Wesley's conclusions that using theological support, Black people have been led to believe we're living under a curse from God and thus are naturally inferior to white people. The reality is that this is a historically repeated lie designed to buttress the ideas of white supremacy. In other words, African American people have been repeatedly subjected to a heinous single story. And so here's what Pastor Wesley says, and he's citing biblical scholar Kane Hope Felder. He talks about sacralization, and he says, if you can sacralize something, if you can attach it to a scripture, if you can convince yourself that it is the will of God, you can absolve yourself from any guilt no matter how evil your actions are, because you have persuaded yourself that it's the will of God, and if they can just prove to you and to me it's the will of God, I can do it no matter how evil it is. This act of sacralization has been repeated throughout history to justify any number of atrocities, from the most monstrous to the least. Wesley goes on to elaborate, and here's what you have on your slide. So with sacralization, you can kill 1 million Jews in the Holocaust and say it's the will of God because the Jews killed Jesus. And understand, I'm quoting. Through sacralization, you can convince yourself that it's all right to eradicate Native Americans and their tribes and put them in reservations while you steal their land and call it manifest destiny, because you liken yourself to Israel and America is your promised land. Through sacralization, you can oppress LGBTQIA+ people because you've got a distorted understanding of the word abomination. And through sacralization, you can endorse the enslavement, torture, and lynching and killing of African people and support apartheid because you believe in the curse of Ham, end quote. So, Black folks have been living under this alleged curse. Ham becomes a stand-in as representative of black people. But here's the thing. While living black can and often is traumatic, anyone who has experienced a form of trauma knows that it can leave you scanning the surrounding world, anxious for signs of danger, breaking into explosive rages, and reacting with a start to ordinary sights and sounds. Trauma can be monumental in its largest and smallest forms. This is why, Professor Hicks, I was saying this morning, to move beyond the trauma and look for the hope and the grace. Because as Blink, a character in the film Cutthroat City, says, Katrina has always been with black people. It just has a bunch of different names. So we thank you now for the bounty you have provided. And here's the story that I really like to tell. In the by and by, how we overcome, some black people entrepreneurs, both enslaved and those freed, held businesses, not just selling foods by the railroad side, although that was very important. They invented catering businesses in America. They helped to cultivate the entire Philadelphia catering community. Women, of course, had an important role here. Look at this woman at the train station in Richmond who was selling rolls and chicken, or these women in Gordonsville, Virginia, who turned this enterprise into being the first black female entrepreneurs in the town of Orange, in the county of Orange, in the city or town of Gordonsville, Virginia. They would sell chicken at the train station and lift their platters to the windows until refrigeration took hold. So there were people who built enterprises despite the traumas. You had met this woman here who was the May entry for a calendar, who was a huge businesswoman. And as I begin to wrap up, I just want to take a moment and share just a couple more slides of the ways in which black folks have, through their work with food, seen a sense of spirituality, seen and experienced a sense of overcoming, move beyond the trauma that they have been subjected to. The Woolworth's lunch counter, it was indeed an actual traumatic event, and yet people moved through. They boycotted. They found ways to move around systems that sought to ensnare them. So I leave you with these few remarks that I take directly from my book. And I'm going to flip through these slides here so that we can get to the end. I'll leave you with these thoughts. There are three. One, food disrupts all the neatness of our lives. There are no easy answers, and it can be frustrating to know this, but it's true. This is the beauty of being human. We cannot fit neatly into boxes, no matter how convenient it might be for others to think we belong there. Two, if we are not willing to do any of the hard work that is necessary to know more about the communities around whom we see ourselves, or the communities we write about, speak about, grow with, instruct, heal, and help, then what exactly are we doing? Three, if we're not in the business of calling out our colleagues, friends, and coworkers when we see them attempting to eliminate histories of communities because they do not fit the right narrative, then again, what exactly are we doing? These are practices of anti-racial blackness, and if you're going to be an ally or advocate of black people, then you should call it what it is. As my colleague Scott Marlowe says, when we fail to acknowledge or take into consideration the myriad meanings that food occupies in the lives of black people and people in general, we can easily slide over into judgment of their habits and behaviors rather than working to empower them to do what is best for themselves. From this standpoint, it is imperative that we begin seeing black people as resilient, always already living with and resisting trauma, with full bodies that may move in different ways throughout the world. Begin valuing black people by not seeing us as unruly and always in need of taming and controlling, but as fully capable, like anyone else, of contributing to all aspects of society, from the kitchen to the boardroom. Thank you.
Well, well, well. Here we are. Can we have another round of applause
No, it's
for this?
fine.
Wonderfully riveting. I am supposed to mention, and I believe it was supposed to come up on the screen behind me here. There we go. that if you want to submit questions, you can submit them via menti.com. You enter the code, and you can do this from your phone. You enter the code 76408625, and you'll be able to enter your questions there. And by some miraculous piece of magic, they will show up on my iPad.
Hey,
If you just
technology.
trust the process. But I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of license now and ask the first question as folks, and I see them pulling out their devices and getting some questions going. So Dr. Williams-Forson, much of this issue of food shaming centers on how one's story gets told, right? We talked a lot earlier about storytelling and infusing it, but the issue here, as you know it, is that black bodies often get signified upon, and that signification is often arbitrary, right? So, given that that's the case, can you speak to the importance of, especially as it relates to food and food shaming, speak to the importance of African Americans telling their own stories?
Right.
And that's kind of where you left us.
Yes.
And so I'd
Yes.
love to see you push that a little bit further.
Yeah. I mean, stories are powerful, right? It gives you the opportunity to shape your own narrative, to say who you are, where you come from, how you live your life. I don't care who you are, right? And so it becomes relevant in this point around food shaming because, as I shared, heretofore, we tend to have a very singular view of black culture and life. Even though we live out loud, right? We have a very because other people were telling our stories. We weren't allowed to read and write during enslavement, so we couldn't document our stories. When we did tell them through the Federal Writers Project during the WPA, we also still had to be careful, right? Because we were being interviewed by non-black people, and we didn't know, did that mean we were going back into enslavement? I mean, there's so many stories that come across my email of archives that people are finding, and just incredible work that has been done in the underground or out of view that people share and are writing articles about. And I'm really encouraged by it because the stories are just going to explode. And you learn so much about your own culture that you never knew. So yeah, it's really important. And the interpretations of that are even more important, right? Who's doing the interpreting?
So I'm going to continue with my license because I can see that questions might be coming in. But on that point of interpreting and who is doing it, I think you brilliantly speak in the book to how we label what is fresh,
Oh, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What is wholesome,
Yes.
what is good for us. And it makes me think of the many debates I've had with folks about whether or not I should get my produce from Whole Foods, Fresh Market, or Food Lion. And you can imagine who wins out. Two of those are going to win over one, to be sure, right? And that also makes me think about the nature of access for folks in African American communities, for black folk who not only may not have one of those stores near them, but may only be able to get to compare foods, or if they're lucky, a Food Lion in some of their neighborhoods. So can you say more about how this form of food shaming adversely impacts black communities directly?
Right, okay, thank you for that. I'll talk about black communities, but I also want to make it clear that it adversely affects anyone who doesn't have access through a car, who may be elderly, who may be infirm. The list of people who are affected by the need to eat fresh food, it far outweighs the list of folks who are able to access it. Let me put it like that. And this is really a sad situation, and this is why I wrote the chapter, my 5th chapter in the book is called Eating in the Meantime, where I advocate for people eating at Dollar Tree, buying groceries from Dollar Tree and dollar stores. First of all, not all dollar stores are created equal. Depending upon where you are, you can get lots of fresh produce and things of that nature. If you can't, I would still much rather know that a person who is food insecure mid-month, and so they can't take their medications, actually find a way to access food rather than going hungry, right? And so here in this conversation, in the 5th chapter, I even talk about during COVID, communities of Asian Americans and others who would get together daily at McDonald's, and not just Asian Americans, but in my own neighborhood, I see lots of aged people who are aging in place. Go to McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's and have community, right, by sitting and eating with others. But during COVID, all of that was shut down, and it had a tremendous effect on our aging population. So these kinds of lack of access, and I should also just say that grocery stores are not panaceas, right? You can eat the same thing from Aldi that you can from Whole Foods in terms of vegetables. The important thing is that you're eating vegetables. And quite frankly, the more income you have, studies have shown, the less likely you are to eat fresh fruits and vegetables. Believe it or not, you're actually eating out more. You're just not eating from McDonald's. You're eating now from Ruth Chris, or you're eating from, some other high on the hog, if you will, steakhouse. There's nothing wrong with any of that, but we have to be careful about scale and how we decide what is constituted as good food and bad food.
Thank you. So I've got some questions coming in, so
Okay.
now I'm going to go to the questions. How do emergency food suppliers fight the normalcy of racism to push for access to culturally satisfactory foods?
How do they provide culturally satisfactory foods and push through the racism? Well, culturally satisfying foods. The bottom line is, if you're offering foods in communities that are going to be familiar to people. So let me give you an example, and I talk about this in the book. I was at a farmer's market in North Carolina that was on the edge of, it had been gentrified, and so it was on the edge of a black community that had been pushed out. The group got a grant to be able to provide a farmer's market and bring black folks into the market, which was the first problem. You want people to come to you. Okay. When I went to the market that was designed to encourage black folks to come to them, I didn't see any cabbage. I didn't see any green onions. I didn't see any eggplant. I didn't see sweet potatoes. I didn't see the foods that would be culturally relevant, foods that I grew up on, purple hull peas, lima bean. What I saw was a lot of kohlrabi and a lot of grass-fed beef, okay? So some of it is about knowing your demographic and doing the work that you need to do to go to the community to say, what is it that we can provide for you? And then you help people get there, perhaps by locating yourself in the community, as opposed to asking people who have minimal access to come to you.
I like this question. Speaking about your research and focusing on the topic of food, and obviously we all eat, but someone has asked, what was it that particularly made you interested in this field of study?
I got interested in the field of food studies as I was sharing at lunch because a former professor of mine who studied Jewish foodways, and I was her research assistant. And when I was researching for her, I had never heard the term foodways. And so this was, as I said earlier, was pre-Google. So I don't even remember what did you do before Google? Did you just write something? I don't even know. Whatever it was that you did on the computer to find things, that's what I did. And when I did that, I said, well, do black people have foodways? I had never heard this term. When I Googled it, several African-American cookbooks came up. And the more I studied those cookbooks, I realized that while folks were doing some incredible work around how to cook food and the historical context, what I wasn't seeing was why these foods were associated with black people. And so when you're in grad school, you're just trying to get through the thesis or the dissertation. So you find a topic and you pull a thread. And as it turns out, I'm actually a material culturalist by training. That is, I study the material world, so I'm interested in objects, big and small. Food happens to be a set of objects, right? And we forget that. And we are all intimately connected to our objects. We have our favorite clothing. We certainly have our phones and our other material goods, including food. And so when we think about food in that way as a material object, we also can understand why people are intensely protective of their foods and intensely protective of their culture, because we all have culture and we all enjoy, for the most part, most of us enjoy food or drink in some form or fashion.
So we have 5 minutes left and a whole heap of questions. So I'm going to kind of give you some quick ones. And
I'll make it quick.
and
I'll
see how we
respond
can
quickly.
respond. All right.
Okay.
All right.
All right, let's go. Rapid fire.
What has been redemptive for you surrounding the discourse of food shaming and eating in general?
Okay, so I didn't even hear the question. I'm sorry, one more time.
What has been redemptive for you surrounding the discourse of food shaming and eating in general?
Okay, what's been redemptive? Oh, wow, what's redemptive around food shaming? I think what's been most redemptive is the amount of research that has come out that pushes back against these untrue narratives that are circulating. I don't have any answers in this book, as I said last night at UNC. I have no answers in this book. What I'm simply trying to get us to do is change the conversation and move it into a different area, as opposed to just always talking about Southern food and soul food and, black food is this, black food is that. I want us to think about, on a complex level, how food means for all of us, and certainly for cultures that are often marginalized, denigrated, criticized, and so forth.
Okay. Has food shaming contributed to food insecurity?
Oh, absolutely. Food shaming contributes to food insecurity. I'll tell you very quickly a story I talk about in the book. When my daughter was in 4th grade, she was, along with the other kids in her gym class, asked to stand on the scale. These boys and girls got on the scale. Their weight was read out loud, and then the teacher said, "Some of you are not going to make it because you're obese and you're going to die before you get out of elementary school." If talk about fear for children. And not only that, and I remember my daughter told me this when it happened. Of course, I confronted the principal, and things didn't go anywhere. But also the fact that children will go to school eating foods that they love. My daughter used to take rice and sauce, and then when people are looking at it and they're like, "Oh, what is that? It smells kimchi," or whatever you bring, or you are poor, and the only thing you can eat is a cheese sandwich because the school won't give you a hot lunch because you don't have lunch money on your card. Yeah, all of that contributes to shame, and ultimately you just stop eating.
Can you share the impact of food shaming on black pastors?
Ooh, food shaming on black pastors. That's a good one. You should take a look at my first book, Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs, where I have a whole conversation around black pastors and food. Often black pastors are revered in black communities, so they tend not to be shamed as much. They tend to be given the excess because of that reverence. So I'm happy whoever asked that question to talk with me a little bit about food shaming. I've seen pastors food shame those who prepare the food, but I very seldom see those who, the pastor themselves being shamed. And they feel very brazen to do so, because again, they're revered, so.
Okay, I'm going to try to get 2 more.
Okay.
How do we thread the needle between food shaming / stigma and challenging communities of faith that can sacralize food cultures that contribute to high blood pressure and heart disease, etc.?
Yes. I get this question a lot. Basically, how do we get people to stop eating bad? Well, first of all, I want to say that unless you're a physician, that's probably not your job. Also, I have learned in the last 2 weeks that people are going to live the lives that they want to live, whether for better or for worse. And so the best thing we can do is not demonize and stigmatize other people's choices in life, because here's the thing that we forget. The ways that people make choices in life on a day-to-day basis go through a 20, 30, 40-step process that you know nothing about. People, especially when people are talking about food and food choice. Do I have food for my kid? Where am I going to get it? How long is it going to take me to get there? Do I have time to get over here? People are going through a number of different decisions, personal decisions that they may not discuss with you. Even if you are a physician, that's a conversation between you and them. But what we have to stop trying to do, I think, is save people and think that what we're doing is best for them when they should ultimately know what's best for themselves, unless it's your child, and you're trying to help them think through options. Even then, when your children get to a certain point, they're going to make their own decisions. But that's where that shaming and stigma comes from when we try to control what other people do in their lives.
Last question. Could you share a dish that has been most revolutionary to your learning throughout your research?
A dish that's been most revolutionary in my learning and in my research, I don't ever really think about food when I'm writing about it necessarily from the standpoint of eating. I will give you a revolutionary story. When I was an undergrad at UVA, one time I was cooking some greens for some friends of mine. I thought I would be super, share with you this recipe from home. And so I made, it was collard greens, kale, and some other things. I took a heaping spoonful of baking soda and put it in the greens because I thought that's what my aunt told me. Okay, and they tasted horrible. I felt like I was eating Ajax or something. I wasn't sure what it was. I just, I was horrified. We had to, of course, throw it away. As it turns out, my aunt, prior, to her passing, said, no, I told you to dip the spoon in water and then dip it in this baking soda. So you end up with a smidgen or a pinch as opposed to a whole tablespoon. And what that does is breaks the greens down so they don't have to cook as long and the nutrients remain and so forth. It's really good. So that was, obviously I was mildly traumatized by that experience because I was undergrad, I didn't have a whole lot of money. And so I thought I was making this really good dish. And it was an homage to my family because I thought I was following a family recipe. But I've learned, and over time I've refined it, and I would say that's the dish that's most revolutionary to me every day, all day.
Amen.
All right. Thank you.
Please give Dr. Psyche Williams-Forson another round of applause.